presentation was on the impact of employee perceptions of inclusion and psychosocial capital on meaningful engagement. So this was my dissertation topic. So I will recognize Dr. Ozer as my dissertation chair for this presentation. I adapted some of it, so some of it is a little different just based on implementation of some of this, but I'm looking forward to sharing it. So the statement of the problem was that the changing demographics has prompted organizations to recognize the value of inclusion and the need to have inclusive culture that is able to serve its diverse stakeholders and clientele. There is also a lot of current ambiguity between current definitions of inclusion, and it makes it challenging for organizations to actually implement inclusion practices within their organization. And then there's also knowledge gaps in understanding how individual capital and personal experiences impact an employee's engagement in the workplace. So also provides challenges in addressing the problems that organizations face when creating inclusive cultures. So the purpose of this study was to help organizations look at their organizational culture by observing the perception of inclusion by its employees. This was also done by expanding definitions of inclusion to incorporate concepts of mattering and consciousness, which has not been looked at in terms of inclusion in the past, but also look at different approaches to inclusion through operational and social practices. The study also explores the impact of psychosocial capital within the workplace. It assesses the influence of perception of inclusion and psychosocial capital on meaningful engagement of its employees, and then it provides considerable understanding that further extends previous research on these concepts. So for the study, there were three variables that were observed. So these included inclusion. And so this definition was built on the theories of optimal distinctiveness theory, mattering, and critical consciousness. And this is defined as an environment in which employees perceive one's integration in decision-making and access to the institution and its resources through the organization's policies, practices, behaviors, and attitudes that enable individuals to feel valued, respected, and able to fully contribute as a member of the institution. The operational concepts that were surveyed in this study were belongingness, uniqueness, mattering, and consciousness. Psychosocial capital was built on the theories of social capital and psychological capital, and this is defined as an individual's access to resources within themselves or through one's network as a form of power, energy, or capacity that can be deployed or activated toward a desired goal and to overcome obstacles in completing tasks. So the operational concepts that were measured in this study were trust, network ties, self-efficacy, hope, optimism, resiliency, norms, and collectivism. And then meaningful engagement was the outcome variable that was assessed. And this was built on the theories of personal role engagement and work engagement. And this was defined as members who are able to be psychologically present in their work and experience fulfillment at work. And these operational concepts included vigor, dedication, absorption, psychological availability, and meaningfulness. So this was the conceptual framework for this study, in which perception of inclusion and psychosocial capital were the independent variables, and I was measuring their impact on meaningful engagement. So there's two hypotheses. So one was an employee's high perception of inclusion is positively related to meaningful engagement in the organization. And the second, that higher psychosocial capital is also positively related to meaningful engagement in the organization. So the research design for this was a quantitative approach. So it was done through a survey of employees, and it was non-experimental and an exploratory design. There was 326 respondents who completed the survey after checking for violations of assumptions and outliers and validity. The sample decreased to 308. The statistical testing for the study, I used a linear multiple regression that was used to test the predictive relationship between the independent variables and the outcome variable. Each research question was tested separately. And then the Cronbach's alpha was used to evaluate the reliability of the instrument and the study. So if individuals who completed the survey, I did check for organizational demographics because a specific industry was not observed. So the top industries, as you can see, were in healthcare and educational services and retail. The company sizes, I did set a soft quota to try and get a mix of different company sizes. And so we had about 30 to 37% between large, mid-size, and small companies. Managerial role was also determined, and majority of the respondents did have some type of manager experience. And then years at the current employer was also looked at, and most you can see were between that 3 to 5 years, but also there was a lot in the 1 to 2 years or the 6 to 9 years of experience at their current employment. Personal demographics were also assessed. So we had about 49% male and then 51% female complete the survey. Between age, we can see most of the respondents were part of that Generation Y or the millennial stage, but we also have a significant number of participants from the Generation X, which is that 40 to 55 age range. And then racial identity was also determined. And so we had most individuals complete who were white, but then we also had different demographics with a number completing who were also Black or African-American. The reliability analysis using the Cronbach's alpha, all variables did have higher than a 0.7. So the survey instrument was considered reliable, and that we could consider the results of this study. For the first hypothesis, a multiple regression model was ran to determine predictability of inclusion on meaningful engagement, and it was determined that there was a statistically significant effect of meaningful engagement that was determined by this R squared of 0.517 and 8105. So perception of inclusion does explain 51.7% of the variance on employee engagement. I also looked at the constructs that were developed in perception of inclusion. So I'll go through these quickly because they weren't as detailed. But belonging did not return or was not found to be statistically significant on meaningful engagement. That was the only one of the 4 concepts that were identified within perception of inclusion that was not significant. Here you can see uniqueness was found to be statistically significant and to have a positive relationship on meaningful engagement. This is on mattering, also had a similar, so this actually had the highest impact on meaningful engagement at indicating a 40.8%. And then consciousness also was found to be statistically significant and to also be a predictor of meaningful engagement. So a summary of the findings, we can indicate that perception of inclusion was found to have a positive, significant relationship on the impact of meaningful engagement. In regards to kind of those sub-concepts, mattering, uniqueness, and consciousness were also found to be a predictor of or have a predictive relationship. Only one, again, was this belongingness that did not have an impact on meaningful engagement. On hypothesis 2, there was also found to have a positive relationship between psychosocial capital and meaningful engagement. And so we can see that that's just slightly below as a 51.6% of the variance regarding of the variance of employees' meaningful engagement. Looking forward, I think I have another slide that does show the impact of psychosocial capital versus social capital. We can see that psychosocial capital does have a higher unique contribution, but both still were significant enough to have an impact on meaningful engagement. So a summary based on that indicates, again, that there was a positive link linear relationship between psychosocial capital and meaningful engagement, as well as both psychological capital and social capital. So the discussion based on those results, we find that that there was a positive predictive relationship, but what that does mean is that employees with higher senses of mattering, uniqueness, and critical consciousness are more likely to be positively engaged at a higher level, but they also may create a more inclusive environment that increases the engagement of others and their colleagues. And then based on psychosocial capital and meaningful engagement, employees with greater access to resources from their social networks, as well as those who have the ability to employ the positive character strains of hope, resiliency, efficacy, and optimism, to drive their attitude and performance and growth, are more likely to also be positively engaged at a higher level. So recommendations is to utilize both inclusive perception of inclusion as well as psychosocial capital to integrate these into different levels of the organization. So I break these up into 3 different groups, which looks at people, environment, and community. And what that looks like is when we focus on people in terms of both inclusion and psychosocial capital, it's really looking at the employee workforce and focuses on the systems that impact an employee's professional experience throughout their time at the organization. So integrating these concepts into different aspects, such as the hiring and recruitment, the training development, mentoring, accountability, performance evaluations, promotion, and achievement, compensation, succession planning. Those are all things that are linked to really the employee experience at a people level that can integrate a lot of these concepts. When looking at an environmental level and how to integrate these both through operations and social, we look at the tangible and intangible artifacts that make up the organization's culture. So these are things like the governing principles, including the mission, the vision, and the values. We look at rituals and recognition, goal setting, strategic planning, diversification of governing boards, structures, leadership accountability, the climate. All of these would really fall into that environmental area. When we look at community, it's the organization's role in societal structures and interactions. In today's environment, we're seeing a lot of how the external environment does influence organizations and vice versa. So really focusing on the branding and public image, as well as the clientele, the consumers, community building relationships, the social responsibility, and then diversification of suppliers and markets. So conclusion and implications, I think that the results of the study do have both theoretical, academic, and practical applications for organizations and companies to help with things related to organizational behavior, culture, and also strategic initiatives and strategic planning. I think in the academic field, diversity, inclusion, psychological and social capital, and organizational behaviors are all areas that are expanding, but I think are also being sought out based on trending topics within society. So I think additional future research and practical implications can be observed and obtained as well. Limitations of this study really focused on, so limitations was that this study found diversity to be a precursor, so that organizations and individuals already found a value in the need for having a diverse population and employee workforce. So this was really focused on the next step of how do you create inclusive environment to retain a diverse workforce. The second part was the eligibility for this study focused on the US and those who were 18 or older. So didn't really look at international markets. A specific industry was also not considered. So that was both a positive and could be a potential negative. But also there was potential bias as the survey instrument did not define any of the concepts. So differences in definitions may have impacted the responses. Future research can look at different differences between demographic data that was collected also focusing on a specific sector or industry, as there may be differences or disparities depending on which sector individuals are working at. I think more focus or can look at individual versus organizational psychosocial capital. And then a more significant focus on the subconcepts of the perception of inclusion. As I mentioned, mattering and consciousness were new concepts that I was integrating to the definition. So more research on that can be done, and also looking at different methodologies through utilizing either qualitative methods or mixed methods may help expand on some of these concepts.